They say that truth is the first casualty of war. Georgian websites were attacked or blocked during the early stages of the conflict, and carefully doctored news was leaked mostly from Russian news media. Those in the West that used to be called useful idiots or fellow travelers began formulating the popular view of this war as a Russian response to Georgian aggression on August 8th. Few understood that a coordinated air, sea, land invasion takes weeks, if not months, to prepare. The idea that Russia responded on the 8th of August to so-called Georgian aggression also on August the 8th is laughable. One could easily note that NATO's note to Russia requires that Russian forces return to positions prior to the crisis of the 6th of August, not the 7th nor the 8th. Arguably, the timeline of this war can be said to start many, many months earlier, dating back to the Bucharest meeting of NATO members, during which both Georgia's and Ukraine's applications for membership preparation were rejected. Certainly, the logic for such a war could have reached critical mass for Russia in the spring of this year, when Ukraine's President Yushchenko announced that the Odessa-Brody pipeline in Ukraine would revert to shipping oil in the original planned direction, sourced from Georgia's Baku-Supsa pipeline, and thus bypassing Russia and bypassing Gazprom. This urgency for Russia would have been reinforced by the resolution of the European Parliament of June 5th, citing Russia's move to establish ties with the so-called governments of South Ossetia and Abkhazia that destroyed any facade of the honest broker in a peacekeeping role, and citing unilateral reinforcement of the supposed peacekeeping force. The resolution threatened to add an international presence in the conflict zone. A similar resolution a month later by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe cited Russia's practice of issuing Russian passports to residents of the Abkhazian and South Ossetian provinces, thus creating instant Russian citizens. But it is the physical movement of troops and other military actions that determines the questions of who shoved first. The final phase of Russia's military preparation was masked as a military exercise called Caucasus Frontier 2008. It started July 5th and lasted to the end of the month. It was held in regions directly neighboring Georgia, namely Chechnya, North Ossetia, Ingushetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Karachayevo-Circassia. The units involved were exactly the same as were later deployed in the Georgian War. These were the 58th Army, the 4th Air Force Army, Interior Ministry troops and border guards. 8,000 troops, 700 vehicles, and 30 aircraft, as well as ships of the Black Sea Fleet, were involved in the exercise. The stated goal of the exercise was to practice invading Georgian sovereign territory to provide assistance to Russian peacekeepers. On July 16th, Georgia actually formally protested this blatant military buildup as a direct threat of aggression against a sovereign state. Curiously, between July 15th and the 31st, there were also joint military exercises held in Georgia, called Immediate Response 2008, with 1,000 Americans and 1,630 Georgians participating. Ironically, this was an exercise to prepare Georgian peacekeepers for duty in Iraq, where some 2,000 Georgians already formed the third largest contingent there. On August 1st, as the above-mentioned Americans were leaving Georgia, 6 Georgian policemen on a truck were wounded by a bomb explosion in the South Ossetia province. On August 2nd, 6 civilians and 1 policeman were wounded by gunfire from territories in South Ossetia that are patrolled by the so-called Russian peacekeepers. 6 villages in South Ossetia were shelled by mortar fire. Keep in mind that in the province of South Ossetia, villages are populated by Georgians, while Ossetians form a majority only in the cities. This is a very interesting parallel to Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, where the villages have remained Ukrainian but the cities were Russified. On August 3rd, around noon, the so-called government of South Ossetia began the evacuation of 400 to 500 Ossetian children to camps in Russia. At 1300 hours, this government called for mobilization of volunteers from all of northern Ossetia. On August 4th and 5th, the shelling of villages with Georgian populations continued. August 6th, 1600 hours, The separatist government refused an offer of negotiations with the Georgian envoy that was sent to the city of Tskhinvali. At 2000 hours, South Ossetian separatists opened fire from mortars at 5 villages. The Georgian soldiers that formed a smaller part of the so-called peacekeeping force returned fire. Heavy weapons were not used by the Georgians to avoid damage to the civilian population. August 7th, 900 hours, the South Ossetian rulers threatened to cleanse the area of Georgian forces that had formed part of the peacekeeping force. At 1500 hours, for the second time, the secessionist rulers refused to negotiate with the Georgian envoy. 1600 hours, 3 Georgian peacekeepers are wounded in an attack by armed separatists. 1830 hours, President Saakashvili announces a unilateral ceasefire. 2000 hours, he demands that Russia remove its official personnel that act as members of the so-called South Ossetian government. 2030 hours, the ethnic Georgian village of Avneri in South Ossetia is totally destroyed by mortar fire from the separatists. 2100 hours, the Defense Council of the separatist rulers threatens to hire Russian Cossack mercenaries against the Georgian peacekeeping forces. 2230 hours, separatist fighters attack the village of Prizi, wounding several villagers. At the same time, heavy artillery fire destroys Georgian police outposts on the outskirts of the South Ossetian territory. At 2330 hours, the separatist leadership orders its forces to open fire against all Georgian checkpoints around the capital of South Ossetia, Tskhinvali. At the same time, 2330 hours, 100 Russian tanks, supported by infantry, enter Georgia via the rock tunnel, challenging the sovereignty of the Georgian state. August 8th, in the wee hours of the morning, South Ossetian separatist forces and Russian peacekeepers opened fire on all Georgian peacekeepers. 4:28 in the morning, Georgia sends in troops into the South Ossetia province in support of its peacekeepers. 5:30 in the morning, additional Russian troops enter Georgian territory through the rock tunnel, through the town of Java, heading for Tskhinvali. 8 o'clock. On the Gufta bridge between Java and Tskhinvali, the Russian forces come under air attack by the Georgian Air Force. The bridge is damaged, forcing subsequent Russian advances to follow the Gurn-Tbilisi road. 900 hours. 12 villages were now protected by Georgian forces. 9:45. Russian planes bombed Georgian radar installations 30 kilometers outside South Ossetia. Russian aviation continues bombing raids throughout the day. 1300 hours. Some areas of Tskhinvali are under Georgian control, and battles continue in the center of the city. 14:15 hours, the Georgian leadership announced a 3-hour unilateral ceasefire to allow the evacuation of Tskhinvali. And at 14:30 hours, Georgian forces control Tskhinvali. 1844 hours, Russian land forces of the 58th Army attack Tskhinvali. 20:30 hours, Georgian forces regroup, taking up positions on the city's southern areas. August 9th, just after midnight, Russian planes bombed the port of Poti. At 15:45 hours, a leader of Abkhazian separatists, and this is Abkhazia, not South Ossetia, he announces the artillery bombardment of Upper Abkhazia. At 16:15 hours, 2 Russian cruisers approach the port of Poti. At 19:45 hours, Tskhinvali is still claimed to be under Georgian control. August 10th, the remaining Russian forces, totaling 6,000 men, 90 tanks, 150 armored personnel carriers, and 250 units of self-propelled artillery, enter Georgia via the rock tunnel. Separately, 4,000 Russian Marines, based from Sevastopol in Ukraine, disembark in the Abkhazian port of Chamchersk. 0700 hours, Georgian forces abandon Tskhinvali for good.